to fully communicate. Defeating a coordinated multi-city ballistic missile attack requires the Aegis networked system to track, classify, and engage incoming threats from multiple approach geometries at the same time, while maintaining awareness of the full threat picture, including potential drone follow-on attacks that the missile salvos might be designed to mask or to force the close-in systems to exhaust interceptors against. The SM-3 interceptors engaging threats in the boost and mid-course phases over the waters between Iran and the Gulf states. The Patriot PX-3 batteries operating in the mid-course and early terminal phase over the capital cities themselves. The THAAD systems providing high-altitude terminal defense. The Phalanx close-in weapon systems as the final layer against anything that penetrates the outer defensive rings. Each of those layers has a capacity rate, a maximum number of simultaneous engagements it can handle before processing time and interceptor availability create gaps in coverage. 2 simultaneous capital cities means 2 simultaneous engagement pictures that the system has to manage without allowing the demands of one to create vulnerabilities in the other. The performance of the defense architecture in this 2 capital engagement is the best available test of what the system can handle at the operational tempo the IRGC is attempting to sustain. Every successful intercept is data that confirms the system's performance under stress. Every interceptor expended is inventory that must be replenished through a logistics chain that the blockade has complicated for Iran, but that the American side manages through a supply network that extends from manufacturing facilities in the continental United States to forward-positioned stocks across the Middle East theater. The cost arithmetic of the 2 capital engagement, Iranian missiles at $1 million each against American interceptors at $4 to $20 million each, is the specific financial dimension of a strategy that was always about imposing disproportionate defense costs, rather than achieving military objectives through the missiles themselves. The intelligence harvest from a 2 capital simultaneous attack is the dimension that the IRGC's planners should be most concerned about, and that the American targeting infrastructure is most immediately processing. Every missile launched from a concealed position reveals that position. Every radar activation that preceded the launch to acquire targeting data reveals the radar's location and frequency. Every communication transmitted between the launch units and whatever remains of the command architecture connecting them reveals a node in the communications network that the Keshem strikes degraded but did not fully eliminate. A 2 capital simultaneous attack requires more command coordination than a single city salvo. More coordination means more communications. More communications means more electronic intelligence collected by the P-8 Poseidon aircraft and the MQ-4C Triton surveillance platforms and the carrier-based electronic warfare assets that have been continuously monitoring Iranian military electronic activity since the conflict began. The American targeting picture after the 2 capital attack is richer than it was before the attack. The launch positions that were concealed are now known. The coordination nodes that were operating through alternative communications paths after the Keshem strikes are now identified through the traffic analysis of the 2 capital coordination sequence. The IRGC conducted a military performance for its domestic audience and simultaneously provided the intelligence input for the next round of American strikes that will remove the infrastructure the performance required. Every attack the IRGC launches to prove it is not finished contributes to the process by which the American targeting picture becomes complete enough to finish it in the specific and permanent sense that 2 capital salvos cannot sustain indefinitely against. The financial dimension of 2 Gulf capital attacks in a single night sits inside the $500 million a day bleeding in a way that compounds, rather than simply adds to the pressure. The IRGC's missile inventory is not an unlimited resource. It is a stockpile that was built over years of investment that requires ongoing production to replenish, and that is now being expended at a rate that the financial pressure of the blockade makes increasingly difficult to sustain. A ballistic missile costs approximately $1 million to produce. A sophisticated anti-ship missile in the Noor or College Fars category costs significantly more. Launching 13 missiles at Kuwait and simultaneously striking Bahrain in a 2 capital attack means expending a minimum of $15 to $20 million worth of missile inventory in a single operational night. Against a production capacity that depends on materials, components, and precision manufacturing infrastructure that sanctions and the financial strangulation of the blockade have been constraining for months, the IRGC's missile inventory is not infinite, and the rate at which it is being expended in demonstrations of continued operational relevance is not matched by the rate at which it can be replenished under the current financial conditions. An organization that is losing $500 million a day in blocked oil revenue and simultaneously spending its missile inventory at the rate of a 2 capital attack per operational cycle is consuming 2 categories of strategic resource simultaneously at rates that cannot be sustained indefinitely. The 2 capital attack is the IRGC borrowing against its own future capability to fund a present performance. And every dollar of that borrowing is a dollar that the $500 million daily clock is simultaneously removing from the account that would need to be positive to fund the replenishment. The 14-point framework sitting in Doha, the deal that has been described as largely negotiated and inches away and almost signed in successive weeks of diplomatic optimism that has not yet produced a signature, is in a different position after 2 Gulf capitals were struck in one night than it was before. Not because the framework's content has changed or because the parties' stated positions have moved. because the international political environment in which the deal's most Iran-favorable components need to be justified to the governments whose domestic political audiences will process the justification has become more hostile to Iranian interests, with every capital city struck, and every civilian airport bombed, and every false military claim issued, and every ceasefire violated. The sanctions relief that the 14-point framework includes, the restoration of Iranian access to frozen assets in international financial systems, requires American and European governments to explain to their domestic political audiences why relieving an Iranian government that struck 2 Gulf capitals in one night during a ceasefire is the appropriate policy response. That explanation was already politically difficult. It becomes more difficult with each operational night that produces a 2-capital attack. The moderate civilian faction that is trying to close the framework is trying to close it in an environment that the hardline faction's operational decisions are making progressively less hospitable to the terms that closing it requires. The deal is not moving toward signature as the 2-capital attack is processed. It is moving away from it. And the distance it moves away is the distance that the next round of American strikes, informed by the intelligence harvested from the 2-capital attacks' coordination signatures, will have to compensate for through military pressure rather than diplomatic persuasion. Trump's statement that Iran's military is finished and Iran's 2-capital response to it create a political dynamic that has consequences that extend beyond the military and diplomatic dimensions of the conflict. Because the statement and the response together have produced a specific narrative that the IRGC is actively exploiting for its domestic audience, while simultaneously undermining its own credibility with the international audience. Domestically, the IRGC can present the 2-capital attack as proof that the American president was wrong, that the institution the world's most powerful military declared finished struck 2 of that military's allied capitals in the same news cycle as the declaration. The internet blackout ensures that the Iranian population receives this framing without the context of the interception rates, the financial cost to the IRGC of the attacks, the intelligence harvested from the coordination signatures, or the diplomatic consequences for the deal framework. The performance for the domestic audience succeeds in its own terms because the audience it is performed for cannot independently verify the full picture. Internationally, the 2-capital attack confirms for every government that was processing the president's finished declaration that the declaration was premature in the specific sense that it invited the response that just happened. When you declare something finished, and it immediately demonstrates it is not finished, you create a credibility problem that is independent of whether the original claim was accurate in the conventional military sense. The finished declaration and the 2-capital response together have created a moment in which neither side's public communication precisely matches the operational reality, which is the specific condition in which conflicts become harder to manage and more likely to produce the kind of escalatory accident that neither side's planners are intending, but that both sides' actions are making more probable. Here is what the 2-capital attack means when you hold all of the dimensions simultaneously as the full picture that the individual headline versions of this story cannot assemble from their separate pieces. Iran's military is finished in the conventional sense that the president's declaration described. The surface navy is gone. The air defense network is degraded. The radar infrastructure is wiped out. The nuclear sites are struck. The command architecture on Keshem Island is obliterated. The financial accounts are hemorrhaging $500 million a day. The payroll is failing. The proxy networks are recalibrating. The world has turned its back. And the military that is finished by every conventional measure struck 2 Gulf capitals in one night. Not because the attacks were militarily effective in the sense of achieving their designated targets, because the institution that launched them is not making military decisions. It is making survival decisions. And survival decisions for an organization that has defined its institutional identity around resistance to American military power look like 2-capital attacks during a ceasefire, even when the attacks reveal launch coordinates and exhaust missile inventory and deepen international isolation, and make the deal terms harder to close and generate the intelligence input for the next round of strikes that will remove more of the infrastructure the attacks required. The conventional military framework says finished. The institutional survival framework says still operating. And the distance between those 2 readings of the same situation is the distance that the $500 million daily clock and the Marine combat missions and the carrier strike groups and the obliterated radar networks and the penetrated tunnel infrastructure are working together to close, not by declaring it closed, by closing it, through the accumulation of pressure that eventually reaches the threshold at which even the institutional survival calculation produces a different answer than the one the hardline faction has been producing for 3 months. The 2-capital attack proves the president wrong in the political messaging sense. It proves him right in the strategic sense, because an institution that has to strike 2 capitals during a ceasefire to prove it is not finished is an institution whose operational logic has become indistinguishable from its obituary. The question that the next 48 hours will begin to answer is how many 2-capital attacks remain between the current moment and the moment when even the hardline faction's calculation concludes that the proof is too expensive to keep producing.